Why do some people experience sudden shifts that silence every voice that mock them, while others remain in cycles that seem resistant to change? Why does one moment become a turning point that rewrites a story, while another moment passes like every other day? Could it be that there are moments in life that are not ordinary, that carry weight beyond what is visible? And could it be that when those moments come, what you do with them matters more than you realize? There are gatherings that are routine, and there are moments that are strategic. A strategic moment is not defined by noise, but by timing. It is a point where heaven's intention intersect with human readiness. It is not accidental, it is not casual, it is not something to be approached with divided attention. It is a moment where something can shift, not because the environment is emotional, but because alignment is possible. And this is where many people miss what is in front of them. They attend, but they do not engage. They listen, but they do not position themselves. They hear words, but they do not respond with understanding. They treat a strategic moment like a routine moment and then wonder why nothing changes. But consider this carefully. What if certain opportunities for change are not repeated endlessly? What if there are moments designed to provoke movement, to activate faith, to interrupt patterns, to create openings where there were none before? This is why spiritual awareness matters. Because when a person becomes aware, they begin to see that not everything is random. Not every gathering is the same. Not every prayer is equal. There are moments where something is being released, something is being stirred, something is being made available, and if a person is aligned, they can step into it. But alignment is not passive. It requires attention. It requires participation. It requires a decision to engage not emotionally, but intentionally. This is where symbolic actions come into focus to an untrained mind. A symbolic act may look simple, it may look ordinary, but in the spiritual sense, a symbol is not empty. It is a point of contact, a way of focusing intention, aligning attention, and engaging faith in a directed way. The problem is not the symbol, the problem is misunderstanding. Some people rely on symbols without truth. Others reject symbols without understanding. But the mature approach is different. The symbol is not the power. The symbol is the point of engagement. The power is from God. The symbol simply helps the person focus, align, and respond. So when a person takes an action, placing their hand, speaking with intention, directing their focus, it is not the action itself that changes anything. It is the alignment behind it. It is the clarity. It is the decision to engage at that moment with seriousness. Because many people want change without engagement. They want results without positioning. They want breakthroughs without participation. They want transformation without responsibility. But spiritual life does not work that way. What you engage with intention begins to shift. And this is where something deeper must be understood. Attention is powerful. What you direct your attention toward with intention, belief, and clarity begins to shape your internal alignment. And internal alignment begins to influence external outcomes. Not magically, not instantly in every case, but truly. This is why scattered attention weakens engagement. A person may be present physically, but absent mentally. They may be speaking words, but thinking about something else. They may be going through the motions without clarity. And when that happens, the moment passes without impact. But when attention is focused, when the mind, the heart, and the will are aligned, something changes. Not because of performance, but because of positioning. There is also another layer, expectation. Expectation is not wishful thinking. It is direction. It determines how a person receives. If expectation is low, even a significant moment may be received weakly. If expectation is distorted, a person may look for the wrong thing and miss what is actually happening. But when expectation is grounded in truth, it becomes a form of readiness. A readiness that says, I am here, not casually, but intentionally. I am not observing, I am engaging. I am not waiting passively, I am positioning myself for what God is doing. This kind of readiness matters because many people have allowed the voices of delay, failure, disappointment, and past experience to shape their expectation. They no longer expect real change. They expect repetition. They prepare for disappointment even while hoping for something different. And that internal contradiction weakens engagement. But there must come a point where expectation is reset not based on emotion, but based on truth. A decision to say, what has been repeated does not have to continue. What has delayed does not have to remain delayed. What has been mocked does not have to remain a point of shame. This is not denial of reality. It is refusal to accept that current patterns are final. And this is where something powerful begins. The shift from passive existence to intentional engagement. A person begins to say, I will no longer approach life casually. I will no longer drift through moments that require attention. I will no longer treat serious matters lightly, because seriousness is not heaviness. It is clarity. It is the recognition that life has layers, that not everything is visible, that not every battle is obvious, that not every opportunity is repeated. And once that clarity forms, something changes inside. You begin to engage differently, you begin to listen differently, you begin to pray differently, you begin to respond differently. Because you are no longer operating at the surface. You are becoming aware that something deeper is at work. And now the question becomes personal. Have you been present without being engaged? Have you been hearing without responding? Have you been treating strategic moments like ordinary ones? And if so, are you ready to shift? Because what happens next is not just about what is being said, it is about how you respond to it. There is a difference between being present in a moment and actually entering it. Many people stand at the edge of something significant without ever stepping into it. Not because the opportunity was not real, but because their engagement was incomplete. This is where the idea of action becomes important. Not random action, not emotional reaction, but intentional, directed, conscious action. Because once truth is revealed, it invites response. And response is what separates observation from participation. There are moments when a person must move beyond listening and begin to engage physically, mentally, and spiritually at the same time. Not because the physical act has power in itself, but because it aligns the whole person with what is being addressed. When the mind is focused, the will is engaged, and the body participates, something shifts internally. It is no longer passive reception. It becomes active alignment. And alignment is where change begins. But here is where misunderstanding often enters. Some people place their trust in the action itself. They think, if I do this, something must happen. That is not alignment, that is ritual thinking. On the other side, some dismiss action entirely and say, only belief matters. But belief without engagement often remains abstract. The truth is this: action is not the source of power. It is the expression of alignment. It is a way of saying, I am not just hearing this, I am responding to it. And response matters. Because many people have spent years hearing truth without ever stepping into it. They have listened, agreed, even felt inspired, but never engaged in a way that required intentional participation. So nothing changed, not because truth was absent, but because response was incomplete. There is also something deeper happening in moments of intentional action. Focus is intensified. When you deliberately direct your attention, when you choose to engage fully, you reduce distraction. You remove fragmentation. You bring your awareness into a single point. And that kind of focus is powerful, because scattered attention weakens spiritual engagement, but concentrated attention strengthens it. This is why many people struggle to experience change, not because they lack desire, but because their attention is divided. They are thinking about many things at once. They are partially engaged. They are present, but not focused. And without focus, engagement becomes shallow. But when attention is brought into alignment, something shifts. Clarity increases. Conviction strengthens. Response becomes intentional. And from that place, prayer changes. It is no longer general. It becomes specific. A person begins to address things directly, not vaguely, not indirectly, but with clarity. They begin to speak with awareness. They begin to reject what must be rejected. They begin to align with what is true. And this is where something important happens. Identity begins to shift. Because when you engage intentionally, you are no longer acting as someone observing change, you are acting as someone participating in it. That distinction matters. Because identity shapes expectation, and expectation shapes engagement. If you see yourself as someone who is always waiting, you will remain passive. If you see yourself as someone who participates, you will begin to engage differently. And over time, that shift in engagement produces real change. But there is also resistance. Whenever intentional engagement begins, resistance often follows. Not always externally, sometimes internally. Distraction increases, doubt whispers, old thoughts try to return. And if a person is not prepared, they may withdraw at that moment. But resistance is not a signal to stop. It is often a signal that something is being touched, because what has been undisturbed for a long time does not remain passive when confronted. It reacts. It attempts to regain control. It tries to pull attention back into old patterns. This is why steadiness matters. Not emotional intensity, but consistency. A person must learn to remain engaged beyond the first moment. Not just when he feels strong, but when he feels quiet. Not just when he feels clear, but when he feels uncertain. Because alignment is not proven in the moment of action alone, it is proven in what follows. Will you remain focused? Will you continue in clarity? Will you resist returning to what has already been addressed? These questions determine whether engagement becomes transformation or remains a temporary experience. There is also something else that must be understood: time. Many people expect immediate results, and sometimes change is immediate, but not always. Some things shift instantly, others unfold progressively. And in the unfolding, patience is required. Not passive waiting, but steady alignment. A refusal to abandon what has been engaged simply because results are not yet visible. Because what has been engaged intentionally begins to change, even if the change is not yet fully visible. This is why faith must be grounded not in feeling, but in position. You stand in what is true, regardless of what is immediately seen. And over time, what is unseen begins to manifest. But only if alignment is maintained. So now, bring this back to yourself. Have you been engaging fully or partially? Have you been responding intentionally or casually? Have your actions reflected alignment or habit? Because this is where many transitions begin, not in dramatic moments, but in the decision to engage differently. And once that decision is made, the process deepens, because engagement leads to confrontation, and confrontation leads to exposure, and exposure leads to transformation. There are influences that do not announce themselves, they do not appear openly, they do not introduce themselves with clarity. Instead, they operate quietly through patterns, through repetition, through subtle distortions of perception. And because they are not obvious, many people never confront them. They simply adjust to them. One of the most dangerous forms of hidden influence is distorted reflection. Not physical reflection, but how a person sees themselves, their life, their possibilities, their future. Because before anything changes externally, it is often filtered internally through perception. If perception is distorted, interpretation becomes inaccurate. If interpretation is inaccurate, response becomes misaligned. And if response is misaligned, patterns repeat. This is how unseen influence maintains control, not by force, but by shaping how reality is perceived. A person may begin to believe, I am always behind. I never finish well. I get close, but something always goes wrong. These thoughts feel like observations, but over time, they become frameworks. And once a framework is established, it begins to filter everything that follows. Opportunities are interpreted through it. Setbacks are reinforced by it. Progress is minimized by it. And slowly, without realizing it, a person begins to live inside a version of reality that has been shaped by repeated patterns. This is why identity must be addressed. Because if identity remains tied to past patterns, future change becomes difficult to sustain. A person may experience a breakthrough, but if they still see themselves through the lens of limitation, they will unconsciously recreate the conditions that match that identity. This is not weakness. It is structure. The mind seeks consistency. And if identity has not been renewed, behavior will drift back toward what feels familiar. This is where many people lose progress. Not because change was not real, but because identity was not updated. So the question becomes, how do you begin to correct distorted reflection? First, you must recognize that not every thought is neutral. Some thoughts reinforce truth. Others reinforce limitation. And without awareness, both can exist side by side. A person may believe in possibility at one moment and expect failure at another. That internal contradiction weakens alignment. Because what you consistently agree with shapes expectation, and expectation influences outcome. This is why hidden patterns must be exposed, not only externally but internally. You must begin to observe your own thinking, not critically, not harshly, but honestly. What do you repeatedly expect? What do you assume before anything even happens? What conclusions have you accepted without questioning? Because these internal patterns often reflect deeper influences, and until they are brought into the light, they continue operating unnoticed. There is also the matter of unseen pressure. Some people feel resistance without understanding its source. They try to move forward, but something feels heavy. Not physically, but internally. A kind of weight that is difficult to explain. And over time, they begin to accept that weight as normal. But not everything that feels normal is natural. Some weights are learned, some are inherited. Some are reinforced through repeated experience. And unless they are examined, they remain. This is why awareness must deepen. Because once you begin to see clearly, you can begin to respond differently. You stop accepting what should be questioned. You stop normalizing what should be challenged. You stop adapting to what should be confronted. And this is where something begins to break, not outwardly at first, but internally. Clarity replaces confusion. Truth begins to override assumption. Expectation begins to shift. And when expectation shifts, behavior follows. But there is also a moment of resistance here. Because when identity begins to change, something inside may resist it. It may say, this is not who you are. This will not last. This is temporary. And if a person listens to that voice, they will retreat back into the old framework. But if they remain steady, if they continue to align with truth, something stabilizes. And over time, the new identity becomes natural, not forced, not temporary, but established. This is where restoration begins. Not as an external event, but as an internal realignment. A person begins to see differently, think differently, respond differently. And as that internal shift strengthens, external patterns begin to follow. But this process requires consistency. You cannot confront distortion once and expect permanent clarity. You must remain aware. You must continue to align. You must reinforce what is true until it becomes the new foundation. Because what is repeated becomes established, and what is established becomes stable. So now ask yourself, what have you accepted about yourself that may not be true? What patterns have shaped your perception without your awareness? What expectations have limited your engagement with life? And more importantly, are you willing to see differently, even if it challenges what feels familiar? Because this is where real change begins. Not in what is happening around you, but in how you are positioned within it. And once that position shifts, everything else begins to follow. There are patterns that do not begin with you, yet they appear in your life as if they belong to you. They show up quietly, repeat themselves stubbornly, and over time begin to feel normal. Not because they are natural, but because they have been present for so long that they have become familiar. This is where many people misinterpret their situation. They assume that everything they experience originates from their own choices alone. And while personal responsibility is real and essential, it is not the only layer. There are patterns that travel through environment, through influence, through repeated exposure, through learned behavior, and sometimes through deeper lines that stretch beyond immediate awareness. But this must be handled with clarity, not fear. Because not every repeated issue is inherited. And not every struggle is rooted in something generational. Some things are simply the result of decisions, habits, and environment that have been allowed to continue unchecked. So discernment is necessary. You must ask, is this pattern sustained by my own choices, or does it persist even when I change direction? Does it respond to correction, or does it resist it? Does it weaken with discipline, or does it remain unusually consistent despite effort? Because when a pattern resists ordinary correction, it demands deeper attention. There are families where certain themes repeat with striking consistency. Delay at critical moment, sudden collapse after progress, cycles of instability, patterns of broken relationships, unusual forms of limitation that appear in different ways across generations. These are not always coincidences, but they are also not final. The mistake many people make is either to ignore these patterns completely or to become overwhelmed by them. Both extremes are unhelpful. Ignoring them allows them to continue. Fear magnifies them unnecessarily. The right response is clarity. To recognize what is present without exaggeration, and to address it with understanding rather than assumption. Because once a pattern is recognized, it can be confronted. But confrontation must be grounded, not emotional, not reactive, grounded in truth. There is also something else to understand. Patterns often survive through repetition and agreement. If a person grows up in an environment where certain outcomes are expected, those expectations become internalized. Not always consciously, but gradually. This is how things go. This is what happens in our family. This is normal. And once something is labeled as normal, it is rarely challenged. But normal does not mean natural, and familiar does not mean permanent. This is why awareness must break familiarity. A person must begin to see that what has been repeated does not have to continue. That what has been accepted can be questioned. That what has been expected can be redefined. And this is where personal responsibility becomes essential again. Because even if a pattern did not begin with you, it can continue through you if it is not addressed. Not intentionally, not consciously, but through passive agreement. An agreement is powerful. What you accept without question, you are allowed to remain. So there must come a moment where you say, this pattern stops here. Not as a statement of emotion, but as a position of clarity. And from that position, engagement begins. You begin to observe more carefully. You begin to recognize triggers. You begin to notice repetition. You begin to interrupt patterns before they complete their cycle. Because breaking a pattern does not always happen at the end. It often happens in the middle. At the moment where you would normally respond in the same way, but instead choose differently, this is where change becomes practical, not theoretical, not abstract, but lived. And over time, these interruptions weaken the pattern, because patterns rely on consistency. If the sequence is broken repeatedly, the pattern loses stability. But there is also resistance here, because anything that has repeated for a long time will attempt to continue. Not aggressively, at first subtly. Through familiar thoughts, through automatic reactions, through internal pressure to return to what is known. And if a person is not aware, they will slip back without realizing it. This is why vigilance matters. Not anxiety, but awareness. A steady recognition of what is happening and a refusal to return to it. There is also the matter of redefinition. If a pattern has shaped expectation, expectation must be redefined. You must begin to expect differently. Not based on past repetition, but based on new alignment. And this takes time, because expectation is not changed in a moment. It is reshaped through repeated experience and reinforced understanding. But as expectation shifts, behavior follows. And as behavior changes, outcomes begin to change. Gradually, consistently, sustainably. This is how patterns are broken, not by denial, but by interruption and replacement. There is also something deeply important to remember. You are not required to carry what has been passed down if it does not align with truth. You are not obligated to continue what has been repeated. You are not bound to expectations that were formed before you understood them. But freedom requires participation. You must choose differently. You must act differently. You must remain aligned even when familiarity pulls in another direction. And over time, something changes, not only in your life, but in what follows after you. Because when a pattern stops, it does not only affect the present, it alters the future. This is where responsibility becomes generational in a different way. Not in carrying forward what was negative, but in establishing something new. A new pattern, a new expectation, a new direction. And this is not done through intensity alone. It is done through consistency, daily choices, repeated alignment, continued awareness, until what was once familiar is no longer natural, and what was once difficult becomes steady. So now ask yourself, what patterns have repeated in ways that cannot be ignored? What have you accepted as normal that may need to be challenged? Where have you continued something simply because it has always been that way? And are you ready to interrupt it, not once, not occasionally, but consistently, until it no longer has the structure to continue? Because this is where cycles end, not in a single moment, but in a sustained decision to no longer cooperate with what should not remain. There is a level of confrontation that cannot begin outwardly until something is settled inwardly. Many people want to deal with what is attacking them, but they have not yet examined what may be cooperating with it. And this is where true progress often begins. Not in what is happening around you, but in what is happening within you. Because there is a difference between being oppressed by a problem and being aligned with what sustains it. And this is where the subject of inner alignment, what scripture calls repentance, becomes essential. Not as a religious word, not as a repeated apology, but as a decisive turning. A turning away from what distorts. A turning toward what is true. Many people misunderstand this completely. They think repentance is emotional. They think it is temporary. They think it is something you say and then move on from. But true repentance is structural. It changes direction. It alters alignment. It breaks agreement. Because anything that continues in agreement continues in influence. And this is where many struggles persist, not because they are powerful, but because they are permitted. Not consciously, not intentionally, but through unnoticed alignment. There are areas of life that remain unexamined because they are uncomfortable to confront. Hidden habits, quiet compromises, patterns of thought that contradict truth, internal attitudes that have never been corrected. And because they are not addressed, they remain active. This is why serious transformation begins with honesty. Not public honesty, but personal honesty. A willingness to look inward without defensiveness. To ask, where have I tolerated what I should have rejected? Where have I justified what I should have corrected? Where have I avoided what I should have confronted? Because without this level of honesty, change remains surface level, and surface level change cannot sustain deep freedom. There is also something important to understand. Alignment creates access. What you align with, you give room to operate. If you align with truth, truth shapes your direction. If you align with distortion, distortion shapes your outcome. And alignment is not only about what you say, it is about what you consistently allow, what you think repeatedly, what you entertain without resistance, what you return to even after recognizing its impact. These things matter, not in a minor way, but in a structural way, because they determine what has influence. This is why inner cleansing is not optional, it is foundational. A person may attempt to confront external patterns, but if internal alignment remains unchanged, the same patterns will reappear. Not because nothing happened, but because the environment was not fully corrected. And this is where many become frustrated. They say, I tried, I prayed, I made effort, but they did not change alignment. And without alignment, effort becomes inconsistent. There is also the matter of hidden agreements. Some of these agreements are obvious form through deliberate choices. Others are subtle form through repeated exposure, emotional responses, or internal conclusions drawn over time. For example, a person may carry resentment that they have never truly released. They may speak calmly, act normally, but internally something remains unresolved. And that unresolved state becomes a point of tension. Another person may carry fear, not dramatic fear, but quiet expectation of negative outcomes. And that expectation influences how they approach life. These are not minor details. They are internal alignments. And unless they are addressed, they continue shaping experience. This is why self-examination is necessary. Not as self-criticism, but as clarity. A willingness to allow truth to reveal what has been hidden, to expose areas that require correction, to identify where alignment has been misplaced. And this process requires sincerity, not perfection, but sincerity. Because if a person is unwilling to see, they cannot change. But if they are willing to see, even what is uncomfortable, change becomes possible. There is also something powerful about correction. Many people resist it because it feels like failure. But correction is not failure, it is direction. It shows you where adjustment is needed. It reveals what must change. It provides clarity that was previously absent. And when embraced correctly, it accelerates growth because it removes what is misaligned. There is also the role of confession, not as a ritual, but as agreement with truth. To acknowledge what is wrong, to reject it clearly, to realign intentionally, not vaguely, but specifically. Because what is named can be addressed. What is hidden remains active. And once alignment is corrected, something shifts. Not always outwardly at first, but inwardly. Clarity increases. Conviction strengthens. Direction becomes steady. And from that place, external confrontation becomes effective. Because now you are not acting from contradiction. You are acting from alignment. This is where true deliverance begins. Not at the level of outward resistance, but at the level of inward correction. Because once alignment is established, what opposes it begins to lose ground. Not instantly in every case, but inevitably over time. Because truth has structure. And what is aligned with truth becomes stable. So now the question becomes deeply personal. What areas of your life have remained unexamined? What alignments have been tolerated because they were uncomfortable to confront? What patterns have continued because they were never fully addressed? And are you now willing to allow truth to reveal not just what is happening, but what needs to change within you? Because this is the real beginning, not of temporary relief, but of lasting transformation. There is a layer of understanding many people never enter, and because of that, they misinterpret what they experience. They see physical symptoms, emotional fluctuations, or life disruptions, but they do not consider that there may be deeper dimensions behind them. Not everything is purely physical, and not everything is purely spiritual, but the two are often connected in ways that require discernment. Human life is not divided into isolated compartments. What happens within often affects what appears without. What is unseen can influence what is visible. And when this connection is not understood, people begin to treat symptoms while ignoring sources. This is why understanding the inner structure of life matters not only biologically, but symbolically and spiritually. Every part of a person carries meaning beyond its physical function. The mind does not only process thoughts, it shapes direction. The heart does not only pump blood, it influences emotional and moral response. The voice does not only produce sound, it expresses alignment. And when something is misaligned internally, it often finds expression externally. This is not to say that every physical issue has a spiritual cause. That will be an oversimplification. But it is also not wise to assume that everything is purely physical. The mature approach is balanced discernment. There are times when physical treatment is appropriate and necessary. And there are times when the issue persists despite treatment, when symptoms appear without clear explanation, when patterns of affliction repeat without resolution, and in those moments, deeper questions must be asked, not fearfully but thoughtfully. Is this only a physical issue, or is there something deeper influencing it? Because when something operates beneath the surface, addressing the surface alone may not be sufficient. There are situations where a person receives treatment, follows every instruction, and yet the condition does not respond as expected. This does not always mean something unusual is happening, but sometimes it does. And when it does, the response must shift. From symptom management to deeper inquiry, from reaction to discernment. Because without discernment, effort can be misdirected. And misdirected effort leads to frustration. There is also the matter of internal connection. What you think affects how you feel. What you feel affects how you respond. What you repeatedly respond to shapes your condition. And over time, these patterns become established. So, even in cases where the issue is not rooted in something external, internal misalignment can still sustain the problem. This is why the inner life must be addressed. Not occasionally, but consistently. Because internal clarity influences external stability. There is also something else to understand. Manifestation. When something is out of alignment internally, it often seeks expression externally. Stress becomes physical tension. Fear becomes avoidance. Confusion becomes instability. And over time, these expressions can become patterns. But if the root is not addressed, the pattern continues. This is why some issues seem resistant to surface solutions, because they are not surface issues. They are connected to deeper layers, and those layers require attention. But attention must be guided by wisdom. Not every unexplained issue is something mysterious. Not every difficulty is beyond ordinary explanation. Discernment means knowing when to look deeper and when not to. It requires balance, clarity without exaggeration, awareness without fear, because fear distorts perception, and distorted perception leads to poor decisions. So the goal is not to become suspicious of everything. The goal is to become aware of what matters, to recognize when something requires deeper attention, and to respond appropriately. There is also the matter of consistency. If something has been operating over time, it will not always disappear instantly. Even when addressed correctly, there may be a process, a period where things begin to shift gradually. And during that time, consistency is critical because inconsistency allows patterns to reestablish, but consistency weakens them. This is why daily alignment matters. Not dramatic action, but steady direction. What you think, what you focus on, what you allow, what you reinforce. These things shape internal structure, and internal structure influences external outcomes. There is also something important to remember. You are not helpless. Even when something feels complex, even when something feels persistent, you are not without influence. Because you have the ability to align, to adjust, to correct, to respond differently, and over time, those adjustments create change, not always instantly, but reliably. Because alignment produces stability, and stability produces transformation. So now, consider this carefully. Have you been treating symptoms without examining sources? Have you been reacting without discerning? Have you been addressing the visible while ignoring the deeper? And if so, are you now willing to look deeper? Not fearfully, not excessively, but with clarity. Because this is where understanding grows, and understanding changes how you respond. There comes a point where understanding alone is no longer enough. You may have recognized patterns. You may have examined your inner life. You may have corrected alignment and begun to see clearly. But there is still a moment that must come, a moment of decisive confrontation, because not everything yields to awareness alone. Some things must be resisted. Some patterns must be interrupted forcefully. Some influences must be rejected with clarity and firmness. Not emotionally, not aggressively, but decisively. This is where many hesitate. They understand, but they do not act. They see, but they do not confront. And so what they have identified continues to operate, because recognition without response changes nothing. There must be a point where you move from observation to decision, a point where you no longer negotiate with what should not remain, because there are patterns that survive on hesitation. As long as you remain uncertain, they remain active. As long as you remain passive, they remain stable. But when you become decisive, something shifts. Not always outwardly at first, but internally. Clarity becomes firmness. Awareness becomes direction. Understanding becomes action. This is the turning point. But confrontation must be guided correctly. It is not about intensity, it is about precision. You are not reacting blindly. You are addressing specifically. You are not opposing everything. You are identifying what must be removed and dealing with it directly. Because unfocused resistance wastes energy, but focused action produces results. There is also the matter of authority. Not authority in a dramatic sense, but in a grounded, stable sense. The authority to say this does not belong here. This pattern does not continue. This influence is not permitted. And to maintain that position consistently. Because authority is not proven in a moment, it is established over time. Through repeated alignment and consistent refusal to return to what has been rejected. There is also something important about language. What you say internally and externally matters. Not as a ritual, but as a reflection of alignment. If you say one thing but accept another, your words have no structure. But when your words and your alignment match, they carry weight because they are not empty, they are consistent. This is why clarity in expression matters. Not loudness, not repetition, but clarity. To define what is being rejected, to define what is being accepted, and to remain consistent with that definition. There is also the role of action, because words without action lose strength. If you declare that a pattern ends, but continue to behave in ways that sustain it, the declaration collapses. But when action follows alignment, change becomes visible gradually but unmistakably. This is why confrontation is not a single event. It is a sustained position. A refusal to return, a commitment to remain aligned, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it requires effort, even when familiarity pulls in another direction. There is also resistance at this stage, because anything that has operated for a long time does not disappear quietly. It attempts to reassert itself through subtle pressure, through old thoughts, through familiar reactions, and if you are not aware, you may interpret this as failure, but it is not failure. It is resistance. And resistance is a sign that something is changing, because what is stable does not resist, it continues. But what is being challenged reacts. So when resistance appears, the response is not retreat. It is consistency, to remain aligned, to continue acting differently, to refuse to return until the pattern loses strength. And over time, it will, because patterns cannot survive without reinforcement. And if you no longer provide that reinforcement, they weaken. There is also the matter of endurance, because not everything changes immediately. Some things shift quickly, others take time, and during that time, consistency must remain. Not because nothing is happening, but because change is still in progress. This is where many stop too early. They expect immediate resolution. And when it does not happen, they assume nothing is working. But change often happens beneath the surface before it appears outwardly. And if you stop during that process, you interrupt what was already unfolding. So endurance is not passive waiting. It is active consistency, continuing alignment, continuing action, continuing clarity, until the result becomes visible. There is also something deeply important to remember. You are not fighting everything. You are addressing what has been identified. You are responding to what has been recognized. You are acting with clarity, not reacting with confusion. And this keeps the process grounded, because grounded action is sustainable. And sustainable action produces lasting results. So now the question becomes direct. Where have you hesitated to confront what you already understand? Where have you remained passive when action was required? Where have you allowed something to continue simply because you did not fully decide to stop it? And are you now ready to move from recognition to decision? Not temporarily, but consistently. Because this is where change becomes real. Not in knowing, but in doing. There is a kind of clarity that changes everything. Not because it removes every challenge instantly, but because it removes confusion. And once confusion is gone, direction becomes possible. You begin to see differently. What once felt random begins to reveal patterns. What once felt overwhelming becomes understandable. What once felt permanent begins to look temporary. And this is where many people quietly cross a line, not outwardly, but inwardly. A line between reacting and understanding. A line between drifting and choosing. Because once you see clearly, you cannot go back to unconscious living. You now recognize patterns. You now understand alignment. You now know that not everything is surface level. And with that knowledge comes responsibility. Not pressure, but responsibility. Because clarity without action becomes regret. There are people who understand deeply, but do nothing differently. And over time, that understanding becomes heavy, not because it is wrong, but because it was not used. So this moment is not just about what you have heard, it is about what you will do with it. Will you return to old patterns because they are familiar? Will you ignore what has been revealed because it is uncomfortable? Or will you begin to live differently, quietly, consistently, deliberately, because transformation does not begin with intensity. It begins with decision. A quiet decision that says, I will no longer live unconsciously. I will no longer repeat what I have now recognized. I will no longer cooperate with what does not belong in my life. And from that decision, everything else follows. Not all at once, but steadily. There is also something important to understand about change. It is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is subtle. A different response, a new awareness, a shift in expectation. And over time, those small changes become structural changes. What once triggered you no longer controls you. What once repeated begins to break apart. What once defined you loses its hold. And slowly something new is established, not by force, but by consistency. There is also hope in this process, not a vague hope, but a grounded one. Because change is not reserved for a few. It is available to anyone willing to engage with truth, align with it, and remain consistent. Not perfectly, but sincerely. And sincerity matters, because it keeps the process real. You will not get everything right immediately. You will not understand everything at once. But if you remain honest, aware, and consistent, progress will happen. Not because of intensity, but because of alignment. There is also something else that must be said clearly. Not every delay is denial. Not every struggle is permanent. Not every pattern is unbreakable. But nothing changes without engagement. And engagement requires participation. You must think differently. You must respond differently. You must remain aligned even when it is difficult. And over time, this produces results. Not always visible immediately, but real. There is also the matter of vigilance, because once something begins to change, there is a tendency to relax too early, to assume the process is complete, to return to old habits because things seem better. But this is where many patterns re-establish themselves. Not because they were strong, but because vigilance stopped. So awareness must remain not as tension, but as clarity. A steady recognition of what has changed and what must not return. There is also a future dimension to this, because what you change now does not only affect you, it affects what comes after you. Patterns that stop with you do not continue beyond you. And this is how cycles end, not through avoidance, but through interruption and replacement. This is how something new begins, not suddenly, but intentionally. So now, as we reach the end of this moment, the question is not what you have heard. The question is what you will carry forward. Will you live with inspiration or with intention? Because inspiration fades, but intention remains. And intention, when followed by consistent action, becomes transformation. So take a moment quietly and decide, what will you no longer allow? What will you begin to change? What will you remain consistent in, even when it is difficult? Because this is where everything shifts. Not in noise, not in performance, but in quiet, consistent, intentional change. And as you walk forward with that clarity, something begins to happen, not instantly, but inevitably. You begin to become different. And when you become different, your outcomes follow.